At our 5th wedding anniversary gala, my father-in-law stood at the center of the ballroom, raised his crystal glass toward 200 guests, and announced that my husband had already signed our divorce papers. I set down my champagne flute, looked out at the stunned faces of Charleston's most powerful families, and started clapping. Slowly, deliberately. Thomas froze beside me. Richard's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered, but I had been watching that face for 5 years, cataloging every micro-expression, and I caught it. The hesitation, the flicker of something that wasn't quite confusion but was close enough to fear that my heart steadied inside my chest like a compass finding north. Perfect timing, Richard, I said, my voice carrying across the silenced room. You couldn't have chosen a better moment. That was a Thursday evening in April. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Maya, and before I married Thomas Caldwell, I was the kind of woman who found inconsistencies in numbers the way other people noticed crooked picture frames instinctively, immediately, unable to look away. I had spent 11 years as a forensic accountant, first at a Big Four firm in Atlanta, then at my own boutique practice that specialized in financial fraud litigation. I understood how wealth concealed itself. I understood how powerful men constructed labyrinths of shell companies and subsidiary trusts designed to look like generosity while functioning as control. I understood all of this. And I still didn't see it coming fast enough. Thomas and I met at a charity auction in Savannah. He was genuine in the way that money raised without accountability rarely produces curious, self-deprecating, the kind of man who listened when you spoke and remembered what you said 3 weeks later. His laugh was real. His hands were warm. We dated for 14 months before he proposed on the back porch of a rented cottage on Edisto Island. No photographer, no audience, just the two of us and a ring his grandmother had left him specifically in her personal will, separate from any family trust. I should have paid more attention to that distinction at the time. We married in the spring. Richard Caldwell flew in from his primary residence in Greenwich, presided over the rehearsal dinner as though he were conducting a business acquisition, and gave a toast that was technically warm but functionally a list of the things he expected from a Caldwell wife. I assumed it was old money posturing. Thomas squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that his father gave that speech to every new person who entered the family. The changes in Thomas came gradually, the way water reshapes stone, not in dramatic ruptures but in slow, patient erosion. The first year was almost what I had hoped for. The second year, he began attending weekly dinners at Richard's estate that he returned from quieter, more distracted, eyes holding that particular blankness I would later learn to document. By the third year, I had started noticing the pattern. Specific phrases his father used in conversation that produced specific behavioral shifts in Thomas within 24 to 48 hours. A tightening around the jaw. A new flatness in his voice when he spoke to me about anything involving money, the business, or our future. I am a forensic accountant. Pattern recognition is not a skill I developed, it is what I am. The night I found the first document, Thomas was in New York for a board meeting and I was working late in the home office we shared on the second floor of our house in the historic district. I needed a specific insurance document from the joint filing cabinet, and what I found instead tucked inside a folder labeled Charitable Giving 2021 was a memorandum on Caldwell Holdings letterhead outlining the conditions of the Caldwell Family Patriarchal Trust. One paragraph had been highlighted in yellow by someone who was not me. Distribution of principal assets to designated heir requires continuous marital status of no less than 5 years from date of first marriage, with no legal separation filings, and demonstrated compliance with family governance standards as determined solely by the sitting patriarch. I sat with that document for a long time. Then I photographed it, replaced it exactly as I had found it, and went to the kitchen to make coffee I didn't drink. Compliance with family governance standards as determined solely by the sitting patriarch. I thought about the weekly dinners. I thought about the behavioral shifts. I thought about a particular evening 6 months earlier when Thomas had come home from his father's estate and told me, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like his, that perhaps I should consider scaling back my practice since it created scheduling complications for family events. Thomas, who had told me on our first date that he found my work fascinating. Thomas, who had once driven 2 hours to sit in the gallery during a deposition just because I mentioned it was a complicated case and he wanted to understand my world. That Thomas had not suggested I scale back anything. I began my investigation the following morning. I want to be precise about this because I know how it sounds. I was not surveilling my husband out of jealousy or suspicion about infidelity. I was building a case the way I had built cases for 11 years methodically, from evidence outward, following the financial thread wherever it led. I purchased 3 prepaid phones from different locations across 2 counties. I opened an encrypted cloud server under a business name I had incorporated 3 years prior for an unrelated purpose. I began keeping records. The financial picture that emerged over the following 18 months was sophisticated and, in its own way, elegant. Richard Caldwell had structured the family business so that Thomas held a significant title and a public-facing role while retaining almost no functional decision-making power. The real authority flowed through a network of subsidiary boards on which Richard controlled the majority of votes through family proxies cousins, a long-standing family attorney named Preston Walsh, and 2 men who appeared on no public documents but whose names recurred in the internal communications I eventually obtained through a source I will not name here. The Caldwell Foundation, lauded across 3 states for its contributions to historic preservation and childhood literacy, had been operating as a sophisticated laundering mechanism for funds diverted from 2 federally subsidized affordable housing projects that existed primarily on paper. The scale of it took my breath away and then steadied me into something cold and purposeful. What took longer to understand was Thomas. I first noticed the sessions with Dr. Gerald Marsh in the 3rd year of our marriage. Richard had introduced him as the family's executive wellness consultant, a title that explained nothing and was designed to explain nothing. Marsh held no public practice listing. His credentials, when I eventually located them through a medical licensing database, showed a specialization in behavioral psychology with a particular focus on what his doctoral dissertation had called voluntary compliance frameworks in high-stakes organizational contexts. He billed the Caldwell family office $35,000 monthly, categorized in their accounts as executive development services. I found his name in the same file as Thomas's. I am not a psychiatrist. I will not use clinical language I am not qualified to deploy. What I can tell you is what I observed over 4 years of marriage to a man I had chosen carefully and loved genuinely. There were behaviors in Thomas that were not Thomas. Responses to specific words or phrases, particularly phrases his father used, that produced reactions inconsistent with who Thomas actually was underneath them. A reflexive agreement to things the real Thomas would have questioned. A particular kind of absence behind his eyes in the days following sessions with Dr. Marsh, as if someone had drawn the curtains on the inside. The day I understood the full mechanism, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage beneath my office and I cried for approximately 7 minutes. Then I started a new encrypted file labeled Marsh Behavioral and began documenting everything I had observed dating back to year 2 of our marriage. I did not tell Thomas. I want to explain why, because it is the part of this I have examined most carefully in the years since. I believed, and the subsequent evidence confirmed, that confronting Thomas directly would trigger the exact defensive responses that had been conditioned into him, and that Richard would be alerted before I had assembled a complete picture. I also believed, and this mattered to me more than I have always been comfortable admitting, that the man I had married was still somewhere inside the person Thomas had been shaped into, and that the best thing I could do for him was build a case so airtight that when the structure collapsed, he would be protected rather than consumed by it. I am not sure I made the right choice. I know I made the only choice I could see clearly at the time. By the 4th year I had assembled the following: 17 months of financial documentation linking the Caldwell Foundation to fraudulent housing grant applications, communications between Preston Walsh and 2 state officials whose cooperation had been obtained through a combination of financial incentive and blackmail, records from Dr. Marsh's own practice management software obtained through means I will not detail here but which my attorney has reviewed and confirmed are legally admissible, documenting a behavioral modification program that had been implemented with Thomas since the age of 14, following the death of his mother. His mother, who had died in a car accident that 3 of Richard's closest associates had referenced in internal emails with a particular casualness I found, when I eventually read those emails, deeply disturbing. I had shared my evidence incrementally with 2 contacts, a senior investigator at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Charlotte, and a journalist at the Post and Courier who had been investigating Richard Caldwell's real estate dealings for 18 months before I reached out. They had verified enough of my documentation to begin their own parallel investigations. They were waiting for one final piece. I built the final piece into our anniversary gala. The evening began the way all Caldwell family events began, with the meticulous theater of Richard's approval. He had, of course, chosen the venue, the rooftop ballroom of a downtown Charleston hotel that the Caldwell Foundation had partially funded. He had, of course, reviewed the guest list, 200 people, every one of them a business partner, a political contact, or a social ally whose loyalty had been cultivated over years. My college friends were not on that list. My two closest colleagues from my practice were not on that list. The list had been sanitized, as I had expected it to be. I wore a dress the color of pale gold that I had selected for a specific reason. It would photograph clearly in the low ballroom lighting. I had tested this 6 weeks earlier at a similar venue. Thomas was quiet in the car on the way over. He had been quiet for 3 days, which meant he had met with Dr. Marsh recently. I had noted the appointment in my records. I had also noted, based on 18 months of behavioral observation, that the conditioning required approximately 72 hours to reach full integration, which meant Thomas would be maximally compliant with whatever Richard had planned for the evening by approximately the time dessert was served. "You look beautiful," Thomas said as we pulled up to the entrance. "Thank you," I said, and touched his hand briefly. He turned to look at me, and for just a moment, the way it happened sometimes, unpredictably like light through cloud cover, I saw him. The real Thomas, looking at me from somewhere behind everything else, confused and searching. "Hey," I said quietly. "I need you to know that whatever happens tonight, I know who you are." He blinked. The curtains shifted back. "What do you mean?" The valet opened the door. I squeezed his hand once and stepped out. The ballroom was Richard's vision of celebration, which meant it was a demonstration of power wearing the costume of joy. Arrangements of white and champagne flowers on every surface, the Caldwell family crest rendered in an ice sculpture near the bar, a string quartet performing in the corner that no one was listening to. Richard stood at the center of the room the way he stood at the center of every room, not loudly but gravitationally, people orbiting him without quite understanding why. He embraced me when we arrived, his cologne arriving a half-second before he did. "Maya." His voice was warm and utterly empty. "5 years. The Caldwells are so fortunate to have you." "The feeling is mutual," I said, matching his temperature precisely. For the first 2 hours I performed the role I had been performing for 5 years: attentive wife, gracious daughter-in-law, the elegant professional accessory to a Caldwell heir. I circulated. I accepted compliments on the marriage and the house and the foundation gala we had co-chaired the previous autumn. I spoke with Judge Harmond and State Senator Patricia Ellery and the president of a regional bank that I knew, from my documentation, had processed 3 of the fraudulent grant disbursements. I noted each face. I confirmed each presence against my records. 40 minutes before the dinner service, I excused myself to the restroom, locked the door, and sent a single encrypted message to 2 recipients. "Tonight, Gala. Initiating final sequence. Stand by." I returned to the ballroom and accepted a glass of champagne I did not drink. Dinner was served with the deliberate pacing of a performance Richard had rehearsed. He sat at the head of the table, of course, with Thomas to his right and me beside Thomas. Preston Walsh, the family attorney, sat directly across from me. His eyes assessed me with the clinical frequency of someone monitoring a variable. I smiled at him pleasantly and watched him recalibrate. 3 courses in, Richard stood. This was the moment he had constructed the entire evening to reach. I knew this because I had found the planning documents on a shared family server 3 weeks earlier, in a folder that had been protected with a password Thomas had unknowingly given me in the 2nd year of our marriage when I had set up his accounts. The folder was labeled Anniversary Transition Strategy. Richard raised his glass and the room quieted with the practiced efficiency of people who had been quieting for Richard Caldwell for decades. 5 years ago, he began, his voice carrying that particular quality of controlled emotion that I had identified early on as his most dangerous register, the one that sounded like genuine feeling and functioned like a scalpel. "My son brought Maya into the Caldwell family, and over these 5 years, Maya has been exactly what I always hoped she would be." He paused. Around the table, guests leaned forward with the anticipatory warmth of people expecting a toast, which makes it all the more difficult to share what I must share tonight. Thomas's posture shifted beside me. A subtle straightening, a particular set in his jaw, I recognized it. The conditioning reaching its deployment point like a program launching on schedule. "The Caldwell family has always placed its integrity above personal comfort," Richard continued, his tone shifting to something sorrowful and resolute. "And so it falls to me to tell you that we have discovered, over the past several months, a pattern of behavior from Maya that strikes at the foundation of the trust our family requires. He met my eyes across the table. The warmth in his face was completely gone now, replaced by something he wore more naturally. Specifically, the unauthorized access to private family financial records, communications with external parties regarding confidential business matters, and the deliberate cultivation of a case against this family that represents a profound betrayal. The room had gone very still. Richard reached into his jacket and produced a document. He set it on the table between us with the care of someone placing evidence. Thomas, who loves his wife and has struggled deeply with this, nonetheless understands his obligations to this family. He signed these papers this morning. I looked at the document. Divorce papers, with Thomas's signature on the final page. I did not look at Thomas. I could feel him beside me, the rigidity, the absence, and I knew that whatever he was experiencing in that moment was not what he would choose if the choice were entirely his. I looked at Richard instead. And then I set my champagne glass down, and I started to clap. Not sarcastically. Not theatrically. Just slowly, with genuine appreciation. The way I might acknowledge a well-constructed argument in a deposition. Around the table, 200 faces stared at me in complete bewilderment. That is impressive, Richard, I said clearly, standing as I spoke. Truly. The planning, the timing, the guest selection, 200 witnesses, all of them your people. The divorce papers signed this morning, which means the 5-year trust condition is technically still met as of today. You thought of everything. I picked up the documents and examined them with the focused attention I give all financial instruments. Except one thing. I looked at Thomas. He was staring at me. The vacancy was still there, but underneath it, something was fracturing. I could see it the way you can see ice cracking before it breaks, the lines spreading outward from a pressure point. Thomas, I said quietly, in the voice I used when I spoke to the real him, the one behind everything else. Do you remember the week before our wedding? The cottage on Edisto. You told me that the thing you loved most about me was that I never pretended. That I was always exactly what I appeared to be. I kept my voice steady. I need you to know that was true. And what I'm about to tell this room is also true. I turned back to the 200 people who were sitting very, very still. My name is Maya Caldwell. I am a forensic accountant with 11 years of experience in financial fraud litigation. Over the past 3 years, I have been conducting a comprehensive investigation into the financial practices of Caldwell Holdings, the Caldwell Family Foundation, and associated entities. I reached into the small evening bag I had carried all night, the one Richard's assistant had offered to hold for me at the entrance, and I had politely declined and removed my phone. The evidence I have compiled has been shared with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and has been received, as of approximately 45 minutes ago, by the Post and Courier. I set my phone on the table face up so the room could see the confirmation message on the screen. The reporting is live. Phones began to buzz. 1, then 3, then a cascade around the table. Richard's face had not moved. He was too practiced for that. But his hand, the one resting on the tablecloth near his glass, had closed into a fist. The Caldwell Foundation has diverted approximately $412 million from 2 federally subsidized affordable housing programs over a period of 9 years, I continued, and I used my courtroom voice, now clear, measured, each number and fact placed with the precision of evidence being entered into record. Those funds were moved through a series of 3 intermediary foundations before landing in private accounts controlled by Richard Caldwell and structured under his mother's maiden name. State Senator Ellery authorized the initial grant applications. Judge Harmon reviewed and approved the legal structures that made the transfers possible. Senator Ellery had gone the color of old chalk. Judge Harmon was already reaching for his phone, likely to call his attorney, which was both predictable and documented. The behavioral modification program implemented on my husband by Dr. Gerald Marsh, beginning when Thomas was 14 years old and continuing through our marriage, is detailed in records obtained from Dr. Marsh's own documentation. Those records describe a program designed specifically to ensure Thomas's compliance with family directives, including, notably, his marriage to a woman of Richard's choosing. Thomas made a sound. Not a word, a sound, low and involuntary, the kind that comes from somewhere that conditioning cannot fully reach. Thomas was not Richard's heir in any functional sense, I said, and my voice softened here, just enough. He was a mechanism, a vehicle for a trust disbursement that Richard controlled on one end and intended to recapture on the other. I looked at my husband. He was also the most genuinely kind person I met in 11 years of navigating rooms full of people who are paid to appear kind. Those two things are both true, and I think they deserve to be said in the same room. Thomas's face had broken completely open. The vacancy was gone. What was underneath it was raw and young and, I realized, deeply familiar the man I had married on Edisto Island, looking out from inside the person they had tried to make him. "What did they do to me?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man finding the words for something he had been trying to name for years. Richard stood abruptly. "This is a delusional fabrication from a woman who has been removed from this family for cause. The documentation includes recordings, Richard." I looked at him directly. "Audio from sessions in which you instructed Dr. Marsh on which of Thomas's natural responses to suppress, including his response to grief, including the period after his mother died." I paused. "Would you like me to play one? Because I have several on this phone, and 200 people are currently recording this conversation on theirs." The room was absolutely silent except for the string quartet, who had stopped playing but who no one had told to leave. Richard looked at me for a long moment. He had the particular stillness of someone calculating exits and finding none. 70 years of controlling every room he entered. And he had walked into this one with the precise confidence of a man who believed his preparation was complete. He had not prepared for me to have spent 3 years preparing. Preston Walsh, who had been a statue for the past 4 minutes, slowly placed his napkin on the table and pushed back his chair. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. The calculation was visible family attorney determining exactly how quickly he could become a cooperating witness. "Preston," I said pleasantly, "I would recommend staying. The agents who are coming would prefer to speak with you here rather than at your office, and voluntary presence tends to be viewed favorably." He sat back down. Thomas stood up from his chair with the unsteady deliberateness of a man learning to walk on newly solid ground. He did not look at his father. He looked at me, and the expression on his face was so unguarded that several people around the table looked away from it. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 years, I said. "The full picture. Pieces of it before that. Why didn't you?" He stopped. "Reconstructed. You couldn't tell me. Because of how they'd... Because of Dr. Marsh, yes." He nodded slowly, processing. "The way I felt after those sessions, the headaches, I always thought it was stress. I know. The summers at my father's property when I was a teenager. The special counseling sessions he called mandatory for Caldwell men." His voice had gone very quiet. "I thought that was normal. I thought all families had something like that." "I know that too." The hotel's main elevator opened. 3 people in dark suits moved through the ballroom entrance with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done this before. One of them I recognized from the 3 encrypted video calls we had conducted over the past 18 months. She gave me a slight nod as she moved toward Richard's end of the table. Richard watched them come with his chin elevated and his expression composed. Even now, even with the room turning and his carefully assembled audience pulling out their phones and recalculating, he held the posture of a man who had never been touched by consequence. I had expected that. Entitlement of that depth does not dismantle in a single evening. It takes courts and time and the patient accumulation of truth in the public record. The evening I had spent 3 years preparing for was not. I understood as I stood in that ballroom, the end of anything. It was the beginning of a much longer and less theatrical process. The drama of a room full of shocked faces and a live news alert was only the visible surface of work that would continue in federal courtrooms and depositions and evidentiary hearings for months and possibly years. But the visible surface mattered. These 200 people were witnesses now, not simply allies. That changed what they could offer Richard, which changed everything. I sat back down. Thomas sat beside me, not in his usual chair but in Richard's chair, which had been vacated when the agents arrived at Richard's elbow with a warrant and a professionally neutral explanation of what happened next. Thomas sat in his father's chair at the head of the table with the dazed look of a man emerging into unfamiliar light, and after a moment he reached across and picked up the divorce papers and held them. "Did you mean it?" he asked. "What you said. That the real me is still that you saw me in there?" "Yes. I didn't know," he said quietly. "I want you to know that I genuinely didn't know what I was doing half the time. The things I said. The way I spoke to you in the 3rd year when I told you that you were making choices that weren't good for us." He pressed his fingers against his eyes. I remember saying those things, but I don't. They weren't from me. They were from somewhere else. I know they weren't from you, I said. That's why I stayed. He looked at the papers in his hand for a long time. Then he placed them in front of me. I'd like to tear these up, he said. If that's what you want. I thought about what I wanted to say to that, and I thought about what the truthful answer was, and I thought about the difference between those two things. I think, I said carefully, that what I want is for you to spend some time finding out who you are when no one is managing the answer to that question. And I want to see what's left when you do. I put my hand over his briefly. I'm not going anywhere tonight. He exhaled. It was the longest exhale I had ever heard from him, the sound of something that had been held too long finally releasing. In the months that followed, the architecture of Richard Caldwell's empire came apart with the methodical momentum of a structure whose load-bearing walls have been removed. Federal prosecutors took the financial fraud case. A separate civil proceeding addressed the housing grant victims' real families in 3 counties who had been promised affordable housing that existed only as line items in fraudulent applications. Dr. Marsh, confronted with the specificity of his own documentation and the immunity offer my attorney had arranged for him to receive, provided a detailed account of the behavioral modification program that became the foundation of a civil case Thomas eventually filed against his father independently, with his own legal representation. Preston Walsh cooperated fully, as I had anticipated. Senator Ellery resigned before the indictment. Judge Harmon did not. Richard Caldwell was convicted on 11 federal counts and sentenced to 26 years. He was 69 years old at sentencing and held his chin at the same elevation he had held it in the ballroom. Some things are too integrated to change. Thomas spent 8 months working with a psychologist who specialized in coercive control and long-term behavioral modification. He described the early weeks as disorienting in a way he said he didn't have accurate words for, like finding rooms in a house you've lived in your whole life that you never knew existed, and not being sure if what's in them is wonderful or devastating or both. He moved into his own apartment in the 4th month. Not as a separation but as, he said, an experiment in discovering what choices he made when the choices were entirely his own. He learned that he preferred cooking to restaurants and silence to background television, and that he had wanted to study literature since he was 16 years old and had instead studied finance without ever consciously registering the substitution. He enrolled in a graduate program the following September. We had dinner every few weeks through that period, not as husband and wife performing a role, but as 2 people who had survived the same complicated thing and were figuring out, slowly and honestly, what was real between us and what had always been constructed for someone else's purposes. Some evenings were warm and easy in a way that felt like recognition. Some were difficult in a way that felt like necessary work. We learned to tell the difference. I established a practice focused entirely on financial fraud cases involving coercive control and family wealth manipulation, the specific intersection I had spent 5 years developing expertise in whether I intended to or not. Within 18 months we had taken on 11 cases. 8 of them involved people who had been told, in various configurations, that their value to the people around them was contingent on their compliance with structures those people had built. My first associate was a woman named Denise who had contacted me after reading the Post and Courier coverage of the Caldwell case. She had spent 6 years as an auditor at a family office in Charlotte and had spent those 6 years watching something that she could not at the time name. She named it now. She was one of the sharpest people I had ever worked with. The Caldwell Family Foundation's assets, once the federal claims were resolved, were redirected under court supervision toward the housing initiatives the foundation had fraudulently claimed to support. Real units were built. Real families were housed. It took 4 years and a great deal of bureaucratic momentum, but the money found its way to the purpose it had been stolen from, which I found more satisfying than anything else in the proceedings. The divorce papers Thomas had signed under his father's instruction were never filed. They sat in my desk for a year before I shredded them, not as a declaration of anything but simply because the document had been produced under duress and represented a version of our marriage that neither of us had chosen. What we had chosen was still being determined, in the patient way that real choices require. On a Tuesday evening in November, 2.5 years after the anniversary gala, Thomas came to my office after a long day and stood in the doorway looking at the wall where I had pinned the timeline of the original Caldwell investigation still there, a habit I had not broken, and said, "I've been thinking about what you said that night. In the car, before we went in. That whatever happened, you knew who I was." I remember. I didn't know who I was at that point, he said. Not really. I knew there was something wrong, but I didn't know what it was or how far it went or whether there was anything underneath it that was actually mine. He was quiet for a moment. I know now. Most of it, anyway. Enough. Enough for what? I asked. He looked at me in the way I had seen only occasionally during our marriage and with increasing frequency in the past 2 years clearly, without the managed surface that had overlaid everything for so long, just a person looking at another person and meaning it. Enough to tell you that the beginning was real, he said. For me too. And that I would like to find out what comes after the beginning. If you're willing. Outside the office window, the Charleston evening was settling into the particular quality of autumn light that makes old cities look like they have always known what they are. I thought about what I had wanted when I had married him on an island porch 6 years ago. I thought about what I had found instead, and what had been built in the finding, and whether the thing we were standing in now complicated and hard-won and more honest than most people's simple versions was something I could call what I had wanted after all. I think I'm willing, I said. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was better than that it was a true one, and we had both earned it the only way true things can be earned. By refusing, even when it would have been easier, to pretend that anything less was enough.